Welcome to the Jesus Movement Live. This is my 55th lesson in my series, A Journey to Faith. Tonight's title is called Evil King Ahaz and the Rise of the Assyrian Empire. In this lesson, we're looking at the period of rule of the evil King Ahaz, our next descendant listed in the genealogy of Jesus, who sacrifices two of his own sons in the fire. During the reign of King Ahaz, the northern kingdom of Israel is decimated, and the reign of King Micah is brought to an end, with Hosea, a puppet of the Assyrian Empire, installed as the new king. The southern kingdom of Judah is surrounded, and the kingdom of Aram Damascus is razed to the ground. In this lesson, you'll see how prophecies are fulfilled as the people of Judah and their king kept disobeying God. The temple of Jerusalem is desecrated, and an idol to a foreign god is brought in to replace the bronze altar. The Lord made it clear there would be consequences, but in this lesson the outcomes are devastating. To learn what happens and to learn what God is saying to us through His Word, come and join me and enjoy this interactive teaching with the help of much historical documentation, which allows us to understand the truth the Word of the Bible speaks to each and every one of us. A Journey to Faith is a series based on the genealogy of Jesus, which you can find in Matthew chapter 1 verses 1 to 17. In the genealogy of Jesus, there are 40 descendants listed from the time of Abraham through to our Lord Jesus Christ. In this lesson, we're looking at King Ahaz, who is the 23rd descendant, the son of King Jotham. In this descendancy, we find that we are now soon running out of many more kings before we head into a time where they no longer rule in the kingdom of Judah. So sit back and relax. Don't forget to press that share button. Let's share the word of the Lord to as many people as possible. And if you do want to watch the video again, you can watch it on our YouTube channel or on our website at thejesusmovement.com.au. Let's begin. Welcome everybody, welcome to everybody who's joining me here, and welcome to everybody who's joining us online tonight. As we mentioned, we've been working our way through the genealogy of Jesus. We're on our 23rd king that's listed in the genealogy of Jesus, and we come to a time where the northern kingdom of Israel is in its twilight as the Assyrian Empire grows, and God will have his way against the people who are disobedient to him. And so we find tonight that we arrive at King Ahaz, the son of King Jotham, and we come to a king who is not a good king. In fact, he does something more abominable than any of the kings of Judah before him. So his name, Ahaz, is actually an abbreviation of the word Jehoahaz. And so we have some Jehoahazes in the genealogy list and the kings in the northern kingdom. And so it's normally mentioned as Ahaz, but it also means Jehoahaz. So he's the 11th king of Judah. So we're talking about only the kings of Judah, not those who were the kings of the United Kingdom, both David and Solomon. And he's the son of King Jotham, whom we had a look at last week. Now he's born in 756 BC, and he ascends the throne at the age of 20, ruling first as a co-regent with his father from 736 BC for 4 years, and then solely for 16 years until he dies in 716 BC. His son Hezekiah, born by Abiah, the daughter of Zechariah the high priest, will be the next king who succeeds him. Now King Ahaz, he gives himself up to an evil, immoral life full of sin. He does not do what is right in the eyes of the Lord. He actually makes cast idols. And you may remember when you read the commandments that God says not to make any graven images. Now, a graven image is actually something that's produced with a graving tool. And so today a lot of people say many things are graven images. So if you have a picture of Jesus on your wall at home or on the front of a book cover, people will say, oh, you shouldn't have that, that's a graven image, but it's not. Because you can only have a graven image that's made from a graving tool. And what it is that when you make a cast and have a die, once you've finished moulding the metal, and it has to be metal as well, when you separate the mould in two, there's a little unclean ridge left where the two halves are joined together. So the graving tool is dragged across the top to clean that idol or that image. And so that's why they're called graven images. And so we find that King Ahaz, he actually makes cast idols. So the last person to make a cast idol was actually Jeroboam the first king of the northern kingdom of Israel, when he made the two golden calves. And he was the last one to make them before the one that was actually made at Mount Sinai during the time of Moses. And so this is the third occasion in the Bible that we hear about cast idols being made. So these cast idols were made for the worship of Baals, and he burns sacrifices in the Valley of Ben Hinnom, but the sacrifice of his own sons in the fire, which we read about in 2 Chronicles chapter 28 verse 3. So again, that's 2 Chronicles chapter 28 verse 3. We learn that he sacrifices two of his own sons in the fire, and his decision to shut the doors of the Lord's temple are probably two of the most offensive acts he commits against God. And so we're going to look at this tonight. He actually shuts up the temple of Jerusalem. He makes cast idols. He sacrifices his own sons. So this guy is on a level of evil that probably hasn't been seen before, not in the kingdom of Judah. So as a king, Ahaz is so wicked that he chooses to not only ignore the warnings of just one prophet, but he ignores the warnings of three prophets. And that's Isaiah, Hosea, and Micah. And so he was warned by three different prophets. So he's clearly not listening to God. He's clearly determined to do what he wants to do. And he's clearly walking with the false worship of foreign gods. So I have this picture behind me, which is on the cover. But just before I go any further, we're just going to pop up this chart. So here's King Ahaz, just to keep some relevance. So King Pekah, we were looking at last week, and King Jotham, and we've just mentioned that Hosea will replace King Pekah. He's a puppet ruler, which we'll come to tonight, and he's the very last person who rules on behalf of the Assyrian Empire. So it's the end of the northern kingdom of Israel. King Ahaz, of course, there's many kings still to go, but we're starting to run out of the period of kings as they meet their demise. And so he's here, and we see that Isaiah is around at this time, Micah is around at this time, and Hosea is still around at this time as well. So the image, as I was just mentioning before I go further, this is actually a picture of Molech. And so this was a well-known false god, which was absolutely abhorred by the Lord. And what it shows is this human-like structure with the head of a cow, basically. And you can see they have the arms out. On the side here, there's a chamber with a fire inside. These are usually made out of bronze. And so the arms, this is an illustration, the arms were apparently designed in such a way that the priest would lift the child onto the hands, the child would tumble backwards and would fall into a hollow in the front and into the fire inside. Whilst this was happening, people are watching, playing music, and the idea of this is it was designed to worship this false god, but it was also designed to drown out the screams of this poor child that's been burnt to death. And so this is the sort of abhorrent thing that was going on. Now, these were being built in the time of King Solomon. This is one of the reasons why the kingdom was actually separated. So these things haven't gone away. And so we find that King Ahaz, the first king, he actually sacrifices two of his sons to one of these things and just burns them to death. Now you might think, why on earth would someone do that? Of course, that's reasonable, isn't it? But the problem is in these days is that if foreign powers were coming against other countries, people used to believe that their gods were more powerful than your God. What Ahaz fails to realise is that God's actually punishing him. If Ahaz actually got his act together and became obedient to God, his circumstances wouldn't change and he wouldn't even be thinking about worshipping a false god nor sacrificing his children. Most idol worship is akin to people appeasing angry gods. We have to keep giving them gifts, we have to keep making sacrifices to keep them happy. And yet not one of these things has ever done anything for anybody. And so this is the sad scenario that we find during the life of King Ahaz. So when God originally led the Israelites into the land of Canaan, the most disgusting and detestable practice he warned against was the burning of human sacrifices at pagan altars. Settling in their given territories, they never completely removed this practice from the land. The Israelites never did remove the influence of intermarriage with people from neighbouring nations, nor did they remove the worship of other foreign gods. So the faith of the Israelites was constantly tested. Ahaz, as I mentioned before, began to govern the kingdom of Judah in 736 BC. He not only turned a blind eye to the worship and burning of incense to other gods, but he went much further. And so if we read that scripture which I mentioned a little bit earlier in the introduction, 2 Chronicles chapter 28 verse 3, and we're reading from 2 Chronicles chapter 28 tonight. It says, "He burned sacrifices in the Valley of Ben Hinnom and sacrificed his sons in the fire. He cast idols for the worship of Baals." And in 2 Kings chapter 16 verse 4, it says, "He offered sacrifices and burned incense at the high places, on the hilltops and under every spreading tree." So it paints a picture that these things are everywhere. On the hilltops and under every spreading tree. And so they must have been all over the land. Ahaz led God's people to follow the detestable ways of the nations the Lord had driven out before the Israelites. And that's part of 2 Chronicles chapter 28 verse 3 as well. Ahaz led God's people to follow the detestable ways of the nations the Lord had driven out before the Israelites. So the very reason that God gave the Israelites this land, when you want to think about it, is because God was actually driving out those in the land who were actually worshipping false gods. And so he promised this land to Abraham and told him when they were to come in that they were to clean out the land and they were not to intermarry. And yet because they didn't do this, they now are doing exactly the same thing. And so for us today, there's the lesson in that message. Now God says if you don't clean out the things that influence you, then they're going to rub off and have an impact on your life, and the very things that he wants to keep you away from, you're going to end up practicing them yourselves. And so God makes this clear all the way through this Bible, this part of the Bible. And what he does is he talks about the sin nature of man. And so I've put this chart up in the past. We have this sin cycle, as I call it. And basically when man sins, God has a punishment for them. He punishes them out of love because he wants to correct them, because he doesn't want them to be separated from him in sin. After they're punished, there's a point of time where they become rescued. But in order for them to be rescued, they have to repent of their sins, and then God will forgive them. And once that happens, he then restores them back into his blessing. And this is the cycle that life goes through. Unfortunately, every time they get restored, we find, especially in the story of the kings, that the next one comes along and does something differently, and they end up sinning again, and they end up walking away from God again. And this cycle just keeps going around and around throughout the Bible. Now, Ahaz, as I said, if he burnt his own sons as sacrifice in the Valley of Ben Hinnom, how then was he able to father an heir to the throne of Judah? Remember, God always used to keep at least one descendant to fulfill the promise of the covenant. Okay? And he said to David that no matter what happens, he will always carry one over. And so here's Ahaz being carried over, and yet he's evil. He kills some of his sons. So we have to understand here that he obviously had more than 2 sons. Otherwise, he wouldn't have the next descendant. And so that's the answer to this question. He didn't kill all of them. He actually killed 2 of them. Now, the Holy Bible describes the character of each Israelite king from both the northern kingdom of Israel and the southern kingdom of Judah by saying he did right or he did evil. When we start off each of the kings, God says he started ruling, his age was such and such, he died after so many years, he ruled for so many years, and then he categorizes them. He says, you're in that box, you did good, or you're in that box, he did evil. That's how each of the chapters start for each of the actual kings. And so during the reign of Ahaz, because he was deemed evil, God called the prophet Micah to rebuke his people. This included the rulers, tribal leaders, and false prophets whose evil ways led his people astray. He said the rulers and leaders despised justice, they distorted all that was right, built Zion with bloodshed, and Jerusalem with wickedness. And so when we're reading the Bible, it's really vital to read the prophets in conjunction with the different historical periods of the Bible. If we don't, we miss out on so much of what was actually going on. And so tonight we're going to fill in some of the blanks which you won't get by reading Chronicles and you won't get by reading Kings. So you're going to find out what's actually happening, not just what happened. And so if we go to the book of Micah, chapter 3, and we've got a few scriptures from chapter 3 in Micah. So we're going to pass around a few scriptures in this lesson. So Micah chapter 3, and we're going to be looking at verses 11 to 12 first up. So again, Micah chapter 3, verses 11 to 12. And he says, "Yet they lean upon the Lord and say, Is not the Lord among us? No disaster will come upon us. Therefore, because of you, Zion will be ploughed like a field, Jerusalem will become a heap of rubble, the temple hill a mound overgrown with thickets." As the Holy Bible says in 2 Kings 16 verse 3, he walked in the ways of the king of Israel. So we're talking about the northern kingdom. They never walked with God. And so Ahaz is now saying, they're saying of Ahaz that he is now like those in the north, and God is busily about to get rid of them and punishing them. And so we find he's the same. This prophetic word says that it's going to be the Mount Zion will be ploughed like a field, Jerusalem will become a heap of rubble, the temple hill a mound overgrown with thickets. And so we're getting a dire warning here that everything that they've built and everything they know, it's going to be destroyed. And so you would think that would make them listen. So as the prophet Micah said, because of you, Zion will be laid bare like a field and Jerusalem will be destroyed. Even the temple of the Lord will be destroyed and its base will be left as a mound overgrown with thickets. And so what he's saying here is Micah is very clearly saying, you Ahaz, not because of the others, but because of this particular guy. He's gone further than any of the others. And so he's being very specific. So the time had come when the northern kingdom of Israel was being invaded by the Assyrian Empire, and now the southern kingdom of Judah had been told that they too will be destroyed as punishment for their sin. Okay, so the northern kingdom, it's on its last legs, and now the southern kingdom's been told, your turn's coming next. So there's no uncertainty in that anymore. So much is said about the nature of the Israelite sin, but the prophet Micah gives us a very graphic understanding of how detestable this had become when he rebuked the kings and leaders of both Israelite kingdoms. So we go to Micah chapter 3 again, but this time reading from verses 1 to 3. So Micah chapter 3, verses 1 to 3. And it reads, "Listen, you leaders of Jacob, you rulers of the house of Israel. Should you not know justice, you who hate good and love evil, who tear the skin from my people and the flesh from their bones, who eat my people's flesh, strip off their skin and break their bones in pieces, who chop them up like meat for the pan, like flesh for the pot." Doesn't sound very nice, does it? And so he's being very, very detailed in the graphic nature of what he's saying. The prophet Isaiah also gives us an understanding of the king and his ruling class. Ahaz was not a fit leader. He was ill-tempered, childish, and did not inspire confidence among his people. He had come into great wealth accumulated during the reigns of his father and his grandfather. The nobles were steeped in luxury. So going to Isaiah now, we've got a few scriptures from here. Isaiah chapter 5 verse 12 is the first one. So I'll give you a moment. Isaiah 5 verse 12. It says, "They have harps and lyres at their banquets, tambourines and flutes and wine." So it's talking about they have an extravagant lifestyle. And their women were extravagant and vain. If you just go back to chapters, to Isaiah chapter 3 verse 16. So Isaiah 3 verse 16. It reads, "The women of Zion are haughty, walking along with outstretched necks, flirting with their eyes, tripping along with mincing steps, with ornaments jingling on their ankles." So their finery is described in Isaiah chapter 3 verses 18 to 23. So if you just jump a couple of verses 18 to 23, says, "The bangles and headbands and crescent necklaces, the earrings and bracelets and veils, the headdresses and ankle chains and sashes, the perfume bottles and charms, the signet rings and nose rings, the fine robes and the capes and cloaks, the purses and mirrors, and the linen garments and tiaras and shawls." Now think about it, this is Isaiah talking. He's giving in detailed description about the appearance of these people, the fact that they're basically dressed, they're partying, they walk with mincing steps, which means they're obviously, as I say, haughty. They feel they're in control, they're powerful, there's someone special. And so he's describing the character of people at this point in time. He goes on to say, "The wealthy and elite of society were absorbed in merriment and pleasure, while the masses were oppressed and cried out in distress." The Lord declared in Isaiah 3:15, so in between those, or just before the first one I gave there, Isaiah 3 verse 15, "What do you mean by crushing my people and grinding the faces of the poor?" And so between Micah and Isaiah, we get this picture painted about how cruel they are to the poor, and yet those who are affluent are having a great time at their expense. And that's the picture that we receive. And obviously we can feel the same today. There's those who are rich and the poor are punished to support them. And so this is happening at this time. In 732 BC, we learned last week that King Jotham died and Ahaz succeeded him as king at the age of 20. Now, whilst all this is going on in their kingdom, the Assyrian Empire, who's become a growing and looming threat, their power had ebbed and flowed for 40 years, so they weren't always growing and they weren't always receding, so it vacillated. So the kingdoms to her west along the Mediterranean coast had ceased to fear her and had constantly quarrelled and warred between themselves. So in other words, there was unrest in the regions that they were meant to be controlling. But now with the rise of the Assyrian Empire, the situation had altered, and the smaller kingdoms began to realise that if they didn't stand together, they were probably going to be doomed. And so the kingdom of Judah, the kingdom of Israel, the kingdom of Aram Damascus, the kingdom of Edom, all those kingdoms, they're all small kingdoms. And Assyria has turned into this huge empire. And I'll show you a map a little bit later. So they had to come together. So for this reason, the traditional feud that had existed between the kingdom of Israel and the kingdom of Aram Damascus, which I mention each week is actually akin to Syria today, since the time of King David, was put aside to form an alliance. They had probably tried to encourage King Jotham to join their alliance, so the father of King Ahaz we're talking about this week, but the Bible tells us that he walked steadfastly with the Lord and would not join them. And nor did he need to, because God was going to protect them. And so we see a difference. But now that Ahaz is here and he's evil, the situation is going to be different. Since the tribes of Israel have first split under the reign of King Rehoboam, the son of Solomon, a battle for the domination and reunification of the southern and northern kingdoms of Israelites had never stopped. Even though Ahaz chose not to do right in the sight of the Lord, and even though his father King Jotham had died, Ahaz still chose not to join his northern neighbours, for he was powerful, rich and arrogant, and probably feared they would seek to overcome him and take the kingdom of Judah for their own. King Pekah of Israel and King Rezin II of Aram Damascus had began to raid the kingdom of Judah before King Jotham had died and before they had finalised their plans for full invasion. So last week we mentioned that they were running sorties or raids across the border towards the end of King Jotham's reign. But now that Ahaz was sole ruler, he was right to be concerned, for by refusing to form an alliance with his northern neighbours, they actually planned to kill him and place another ruler on the throne whose assistance they could call upon. And so, soon after the death of his father, the newly crowned King Ahaz learnt in Isaiah chapter 7 verse 12, it says, Aram has allied itself with Ephraim. Isaiah chapter 7 verse 2. So once again, from the prophetic books, we learn probably more about what's going on around than we do directly from the book of Kings and Chronicles. So Aram has allied itself with Ephraim. Ephraim, if you're not aware, is another name that was actually used for the northern kingdom of Israel. Ephraim is one of the tribes of the northern kingdom of Israel. So there was Samaria, the northern kingdom of Israel, and there was Ephraim. So this actually talks about the northern kingdom of Israel. So of course, Ahaz and his people were shaken by this news. But before anything happened, the prophet Isaiah, who lived in Jerusalem, was told by the Lord in Isaiah 7 verse 3, so the next verse, Go out, you and your son Shear Yashub, to meet Ahaz at the end of the aqueduct of the upper pool, on the road to the washerman's field. So Isaiah is giving very specific directions on where he is to actually go. So King Ahaz watched as the prophet Isaiah and his son approached him. He knew them, but because he did not walk with the Lord, he was wary of them. After exchanging greetings, Isaiah said in Isaiah chapter 7 verses 4 to 9, Be careful, keep calm, and don't be afraid. Do not lose heart because of these two smouldering stubs of firewood. The smouldering stubs, of course, are Aram Damascus and the northern kingdom of Israel. Remember the description when they said they took the people away to the Assyrians took the people of Israel away? They said they'd lead 1 out of 10 in the land, and they called them the stumps. And so we see this same language coming through. Two smouldering stubs of firewood. Because of the fierce anger of Rezin and Aram and the son of Remaliah. Aram, Ephraim and Remaliah's son have plotted your ruin, saying, Let us invade Judah, let us tear it apart and divide it among ourselves, and make the son of Tabeel king over it. Yet this is what the sovereign Lord says, It will not take place, it will not happen, for the head of Aram is Damascus, and the head of Damascus is only Rezin. So in other words, the Lord's saying he's not very powerful. Within 65 years, Ephraim will be too shattered to be a people. The head of Ephraim is Samaria, and the head of Samaria is only Remaliah's son. If you do not stand firm in your faith, you will not stand at all. And so this scripture explains who all of them are and where they actually come from. And so the Lord is categorically saying that it's not going to happen and it's not going to take place. So King Ahaz was encouraged to ask the Lord for a sign, but he refused, saying he would not put the Lord to the test. So Isaiah said the Lord himself will give him a sign. And so if we go to Isaiah chapter 7 verses 14 to 17 this time, Isaiah 7 verses 14 to 17. You see how much time we're spending outside of the book of Chronicles and Kings to actually tell the story. We're getting more from the prophets than we are from the actual core historical documentation from Kings and Chronicles. And so we're bringing this to life by understanding all of the dialogue and the descriptions through the books of the prophets. So again, Isaiah chapter 7, verses 14 to 17. It reads, "The virgin will be with child, and will give birth to a son, and will call him Emmanuel," which of course means God with us. "He will eat curds and honey when he knows enough to reject the wrong and choose the right. But before the boy knows enough to reject the wrong and choose the right, the land of the two kings you dread will be laid to waste. The Lord will bring on you and on your people and on the house of your father a time unlike any since Ephraim broke away from Judah." So of course that's the northern kingdom of Israel separating from the southern kingdom of Judah in the reign of King Rehoboam. And then the last part says, he will bring the king of Assyria. Who do you think they're talking about there? It sounds a lot like Jesus, doesn't it?
It sounds like Jesus, yeah.
But it's not. Because there's some details in here that tell you it can't be, because they align it with the particular events in history which don't happen at the same time.
I say his name will be Emmanuel.
Right. So just let me explain. So there's two components to what Isaiah is saying. So often what happens is a lot of prophetic words, they're saying something for here and now, and then they're saying something for what's going to happen in the future at the same time. And so you almost have to be able to see that there's more than one thing being said in the passage. So the prophecy of a sign given here by Isaiah, initially it's not about Jesus, because this child born of the flesh will not even be old enough to know the difference between right and wrong by the time a king Assyria invades the kingdom of Judah. See that part there? Knows enough to reject the wrong and choose the right. Okay? And so this is giving us some information that tells us it's not Jesus. In effect, it says the time is short, the duration of a pregnancy plus a bit. So when they're talking about a child, they're talking about the amount of time that it takes for a child to be conceived and to be born. So we're talking about how long?
Years altogether.
At least a year. If it's a longer birth, 9, 10 months, 11 months.
A year and a bit. Sorry, a birth and a bit.
A birth and a bit. There you go. Well done. So yeah, so we're talking about a year or a little bit under, perhaps. Okay, and so we get some information from that. So this is confirmed in Isaiah chapter 8. If we go to chapter 8, verse 3 to 4. When Isaiah explained how he went to a prophetess who conceived and gave birth to a son who, before he knows how to say my father or my mother, will be alive when the wealth of Damascus and the plunder of Samaria will be carried off by the king of Assyria. And so we follow the following scripture and we find some more information. So again, Isaiah 8 verses 3 to 4. So we're talking about a period of time and a sequence of events that's going to happen. But we also see, of course, that Isaiah prophesies into the future at the same time. And so at the same time after Isaiah revealed to Ahaz the pending wrath of God at the hands of Assyria, remember Isaiah 7:14 to 17? It said he will bring the king of Assyria. So at the time, soon after Isaiah revealed to Ahaz the pending wrath of God at the hands of Assyria, he revealed God's love and mercy when he also spoke of a future king that will reign with justice and righteousness forever. And in Isaiah chapter 9 verse 1, it actually says forever, who will honour Galilee of the Gentiles. Okay, what's the Galilee of the Gentiles? What do you think he's describing there? What is the Galilee of the Gentiles? We all know the Sea of Galilee. We know the Gentiles are not the people of Judah. But what's he talking about here? Galilee of the Gentiles. So we go forward to the time of Jesus, and I've shown maps of this before on Sundays. The region of Galilee, the Roman region, is to the left of the Sea of Galilee between the Mediterranean and the Sea of Galilee. It's named Galilee in that day. Right? It's during the time of the Gentiles, which means they're under Gentile rule. And so what we're talking about here is that actually, of course, talking about Jesus, because they're saying that will reign with justice and righteousness forever, who will honour Galilee of the Gentiles. This, of course, is Jesus, the Messiah. And so what's happening in this period of time with Isaiah is he's talking about what's happening right now, and he's also talking about what's going to happen in the future. So he's saying everything's going to go pear-shaped right now, but in the future God's going to bring one who's going to change everything. And so when we continue reading in Isaiah, we come across this well-known scripture in chapter 9, verses 6 to 7. And of course it says, "For to us a child is born, to us a son is given, and the government will be on his shoulders. And he will be called Wonderful Counselor, Mighty God, Everlasting Father, Prince of Peace. Of the increase of his government and peace there will be no end. He will reign on David's throne and over his kingdom, establishing and upholding it with justice and righteousness." There's those words, "from that time on and forever. The zeal of the Lord Almighty will accomplish this." And so, going back to chapter 9, verse 1, I've just opened my Bible to put a bit more detail around this. The chapter is called "To Us a Child is Born" because they're talking about the future, but they're also talking about the present. Now in verse 1 it says, "Nevertheless there will be no more gloom for those who were in distress. In the past he humbled the land of Zebulun and the land of Naphtali, but in the future he will honour Galilee of the Gentiles by the way of the sea along the Jordan." Okay, so let's bring this explanation. Last week we spoke about King Jotham, and what happened? The Assyrians came through and they took over Naphtali and Zebulun. That's the two places they're talking about in the scripture. This same region is actually what's known as the Galilee. Okay? So in the past, they were the tribes of Naphtali and the tribes of Zebulun, and now in the present, in the time of Jesus, it's known as the Galilee. And the Galilee is called Galilee in that time. The Assyrians came down through here and they went in and they overtook the area of Gilead as well, but they didn't stay, they went back out again at that point in history. But now during the reign of King Ahaz and King Pekah, we're going to find out that they're going to come in this time and they're not going to go away. They're going to come in, they're going to take over all this land, and they're going to surround the kingdom of Judah. Okay? So does that help? So there's two things happening at the same time. Isaiah is prophesying in the present, in the here and now. There's going to be 9 months, almost a year, and then in the future the Messiah will come. And he differentiates because he talks about the tribes at the time that were overcome in the reign of King Jotham, which happens to be right at the end of the reign of King Jotham, which happens to be during the co-regency of his son, who we're talking about this week, King Ahaz. So the evil rule of King Ahaz had already undergone a transformation in the beginning of his time as a co-regent, even whilst his father was still listed as the ruler. In fact, when you look at the dates and you check the Bible, I didn't speak about it tonight, but it appears that the two sons that he actually sacrificed were actually sacrificed before he became king. So they were during this same time. So when he sacrificed his sons, God sent the Assyrians in, and all of those events happened at the same time. King Jotham was still alive. It was in the last few years of his reign. So all of this is all intertwined. Isaiah's in there, Micah's in there, Hosea's in there, and so we have a few of the prophets trying to sort this situation out. They're not listening, so now they're actually warning them that it's all over because of it. And so that's something that's occurring here. Okay, so moving on, going back to King Rezin of Aram Damascus, so today's Syria, and King Pekah of Israel, it says that they marched up to fight against Jerusalem. They besieged King Ahaz, and God was angry with him for leading the people of Judah to sin. So in 2 Chronicles, going back to the book of 2 Chronicles chapter 28, verse 5, it says, "Therefore the Lord his God handed him over to the king of Aram, And the Arameans defeated him and took many of his people as prisoners and brought them to Damascus. He was also given into the hands of the king of Israel, who inflicted heavy casualties on him. And so we see King Ahaz isn't escaping his actions. God is actually sending those people who worship foreign gods in to punish him for worshipping foreign gods. And so God's punishment is unfolding at this point in time. Now King Pekah of Israel and King Rezin of Aram Damascus besieged the fortified city of Jerusalem, but were unable to overpower its battlements or kill Ahaz. And we can read about that in 2 Kings chapter 16 verse 5. So they were unable to overpower its battlements or to kill Ahaz, because the fortifications of his grandfather, who was King Uzziah, and his father King Jotham, had greatly strengthened the city. So King Rezin and of Aram Damascus took many people prisoner from outside of the city throughout the land of Judah and took them back to Damascus, his capital. So we hear in here they came right up to the city of Jerusalem. They couldn't defeat it. They couldn't get King Ahaz. And so they went out around and about and they took people from the kingdom of Judah. And so we see they didn't get away scot-free, but they got a reprieve. He also took advantage of Ahaz being cooped up, for he drove out the men of Judah from the Red Sea port city of Elath, the southernmost point of Judah's territories, claiming the city for Syria. The local Edomites moved in and settled there. Okay, I'm just going to put up the next map as I'm speaking. This map provides us with a lot of details because there's multiple things that happen. We haven't spoken about some of them yet. But we've got the Elath down the bottom, Elath. And so this is where the King Rezin, he went down and he overcame this region down there and took it back away from the people of Judah. He's come down and he's attacking Jerusalem from Samaria. We've got King Pekah of Israel. He's coming down attacking. And I'm just going to start speaking to the fact that the Philistines decided that they'd join in with him, and the Edomites thought that they'd join in as well. So here's King Ahaz in his city, and suddenly we have every single nation around them, apart from the Ammonites and the Moabites. Every other nation on that side of the river is attacking them. And so things are getting pretty out of shape at this point in time. Okay, so King Pekah of Israel also inflicted heavy casualties on Ahaz. In 2 Chronicles chapter 28 verse 6 it says, in one day he killed 120,000 soldiers in Judah. 120,000 soldiers in one day. I mean, that's a huge number. So when you look at that, it really paints the picture of what this battle must have looked like. Zikri, Z-I-C-R-I, a soldier from the Israelite tribe of Ephraim, it says killed in 2 Chronicles chapter 28 verse 7 we're reading. It says killed Maaseiah the king's son, Azrikam the officer in charge of the palace, and Elkanah second to the king. And so what we know from that is all of those high-placed officials and another son have now been killed as well. The Israelites captured 200,000 Judean wives, sons and daughters, and took them back to their capital in Samaria along with a lot of plunder. So this must have been horrific. The assault is massive, it's coming from multiple fronts, and huge numbers of people are being killed or taken away. Soldiers killed, wives, sons and daughters taken away. When the soldiers returned to Samaria, they were confronted, however, by a prophet named Oded, O-D-E-D, who said to them in 2 Chronicles chapter 28, verses 9 to 10, because the Lord, the God of your fathers, was angry with Judah, he gave them into your hand. And so through prophetic words, we always learn when people think they're powerful and things are happening because of them, we learn that they're not. It's happening because God's allowing it to happen. It goes on to read, but you have slaughtered them in a rage that reaches to heaven. And now you intend to make the men and women of Judah and Jerusalem your slaves. But aren't you also guilty of sins against the Lord your God? So that's a broadside warning, isn't it? You're getting all of these plunder and all of these people because God's hand's in it. And he's saying, but you're also guilty of the same. So what happens now if you take away these innocent people? And so suddenly they're like, oh, because it's not about them. It's actually what's happening with the Lord. So making them consider the consequences of their actions, Oded instructed them, and we're going to read from 2 Chronicles chapter 28 again, but in verse 11, and he said, now listen to me, send back your fellow countrymen you have taken as prisoners, for the Lord's fierce anger rests on you. Then 4 leaders in the northern kingdom territory of Ephraim, they were called Azariah, Berechiah, Jehizkiah and Amasa, confronted the soldiers, and they said in verse 13, you must not bring those prisoners here, or we will be guilty before the Lord. So it's stacking up against them. They're trying to bring all these people, and they're getting confrontation from leaders saying no, they're getting prophet saying no, because you're going to have something terrible happen to you if you just keep going with this. And so we get to this point where there's a bit of an impasse pretty much at the border. Now, although the Israelites have been separated into 2 kingdoms for 2 centuries, the people still recognised the prisoners were their kinsmen. They were the same blood descendants, and understood this action will incur God's wrath. Fearfully, they handed the prisoners and the plunder over to the 4 leaders of Ephraim, who stopped them. Now, the degradation and suffering of the prisoners was severe. Many of them were naked, hurt, and suffering from starvation and dehydration. Many were so weak that they had to be put onto donkeys for their return. So this is in 2 Chronicles chapter 28 verses 14 to 15, so continuing on through 2 Chronicles chapter 28. The 4 leaders took them back across the border to Jericho, known as the City of Palms. And then they returned from there to Samaria. So I'm sure you're all familiar, but here's Jericho here. So they've taken the people from the land. They were trying to take them back. This is the region of Ephraim here. And so the leaders have taken them back down to this location at Jericho to hand them over again. So while Ahaz was cooped up in the city of Jerusalem and under attack from his neighbours in the north, the people previously conquered territories, they rose up. The Edomites came and attacked Judah from the south and carried away some prisoners, whilst the Philistines, it says in 2 Chronicles 28 verse 18, raided the towns in the western foothills and in the Negev of southern Judah to regain several cities they had lost to previous kings of Judah. They recovered Beth Shemesh west of Jerusalem, Ajalon on the lowland overlooking the Ajalon Valley of the Shephelah, a place called Gederoth, Sokar, Timnah and Gimzo. The Philistines then settled into these places permanently, and so these are all placed on the map to help us. So there's Gimzo, Ajalon, Beth Shemesh, Timnah, Soko and Gederoth. So this region here is all part of the Valley of Sorek, and so the Philistines came in these different directions from where they were along the coast, and they took all this region back. And so at this point in time, King Ahaz has everybody coming at him from every direction. He's lost his territory down to the Red Sea. He's lost the territories in the foothills over here. He's had King Rezin come down and take away and kill all the soldiers. King Pekah come down and try and take all the people and kill more soldiers. And he's actually holed up in the grounds of the walls of Jerusalem. And so it's out of control basically. So God is throwing everything at this man because of his sin. God said he was evil, and so he's being punished. In 2 Chronicles chapter 28 again verse 19, it says, the Lord had humbled Judah because of Ahaz king of Israel, for he had promoted wickedness in Judah and had been most unfaithful to the Lord. So the Bible's making it clear it's about him, he's their leader, and he's the one being disobedient. And so this punishment is happening because of him. So despite the word of the Lord, the prophet Isaiah had given him, King Ahaz was so desperate he sought to give up the independent sovereignty of the kingdom of Judah to save himself. So he's quite a guy, isn't he? So now he's going to give it up. So in Isaiah chapter 7 verses 4 to 9, he was most unfaithful to the Lord and had been told, if you do not stand firm in your faith, you will not stand at all. So Isaiah said to him, if you try and do a runner or you try and do anything else, then you're not going to stand at all. So in other words, he's got nowhere to go. The only thing that will save his life is to stand firm in his faith, which means he has to repent of his sins and he has to come back to faith in the Lord. Nothing else will suffice. And so a lesson for all of us, when things are going wrong, nothing else will suffice. Repent and turn and change your ways. So under siege and desperate, King Ahaz then appealed for help from the emperor of Assyria. Okay, so the biggest enemy they've got, the most powerful in the region, he appeals to him to come and take out all of those who are coming at him from closer by. So he sent messengers to the emperor's palace in Karlu, which is Nimrod, to say to King Tiglath-Pileser in 2 Kings chapter 16 verse 7. So we're bouncing around the books of the Bible tonight because we have to do this to pull the whole story together. He says, 2 Kings chapter 16 verse 7, I am your servant and vassal. Come up and save me out of the hand of the king of Aram and the king of Israel who are attacking me. So that's a really important statement. He said, I am your servant and vassal. What's a vassal? A vassal state or a vassal servant? What does a vassal mean? Does anyone know that word? It's an ancient word.
Like a main city or something?
No, it's not a location.
Your son?
Your son, no. If you are a vassal or a vassal state, that means you are submitted to an authority above you and you have to pay tribute, as they called it in those days, meaning taxes like you do today. So in other words, for your protection, I will give you something back for it. And so that means he submits his authority and says, I am no longer king over this land, I will be the king of this land under your authority. Okay? And so he's not going to run away, which God said, you can't run away. But he now goes to Assyria and says, well, I'll submit to you if you come and help me. So basically, he's got to hand over the goods. And so I think I've got a picture here, just a refresh. So this is Tiglath-Pileser III now. So this is the Assyrian Empire that we're actually talking about. So here we are with the reign of King Ahaz. And you see that Tiglath-Pileser is quite a long reigning ruler. And he ruled during the time of Uzziah, grandfather, Jotham, his father, and Ahaz. And so Ahaz is actually going to live through this king, and also the next, and also to the next. Okay, so we see that the dates on these kings, they start shortening up. This one here is only 5 years of rule, and this one here has a longer rule, but Ahaz only lasts for a short time during that time. Okay, so we'll follow that chart to keep you up to date with who's who. Okay, so 2 Chronicles, chapter 28 again, verse 20, reads, Tiglath-Pileser, king of Assyria, came to him, but he gave him trouble instead of help. So a foolish man who's weakened by his own evil would submit himself to an even larger evil force. And so Ahaz thinks this is a way out. In fact, he just buries himself even deeper in it. So King Ahaz soon realised that to receive the help of the Assyrian emperor, he would need to make it worth his while and pay a tribute. And so it says, and Ahaz took the silver and gold found in the temple of the Lord and in the treasuries of the royal palace and sent it as a gift to the king of Assyria. What do you think the king of Assyria did with that? So thanks very much. Do you think it would have changed his mind? Absolutely not. And so this is the foolishness, a good lesson for us, isn't it? If something's coming against us and we submit to someone to help us against something in the wrong way, and then we give something away to them, do you really expect to get anything back? And so this man does this, and of course he comes unstuck. Now the interesting thing is, this actual transaction is actually historically recorded. And so we're getting into the time of the Bible now where the documentation of the different empires and kingdoms is quite good. And so there's a clay cuneiform tablet known as the Nimrod tablet. It's actually called K3751 because they actually put a number because there's literally thousands of them. And it's from circa 733 BC. It contains the first known archaeological reference of King Ahaz and Judah as one of many who were paying tribute to Tiglath-Pileser III. And so when they receive something, like a good accountant or a bank account, they jot down the details. I got this much from them, and so in those days they used the cuneiform tablet. I haven't got a picture for you, but I've shown before, cuneiform tablet is a clay tablet that's soft, and they would have a piece of metal or a piece of wood that's shaped like a long, thin triangle. And what they do is they press these in different patterns into the clay, and that's how their writing actually started off. And so when that clay was fired and went hard, they would have this physical record of everything that was done. But that's how they made cuneiform tablets. Piece of clay, press all the digits in there, fire it, and then you've got a permanent record. And so there's literally thousands upon thousands of these in these ancient kingdoms. Okay, so after receiving the tribute from Ahaz, King Tiglath-Pileser from Assyria marched his army west. Bypassing Damascus, he came to the Mediterranean coast, where he turned to the south and captured the coastal cities all the way down to Egypt, effectively cutting off his enemies' access to the sea. So all of those nations, no more access to the sea. He then turned to the northern kingdom of Israel and destroyed their army. The people from the tribes of Reuben, Gad and Manasseh were deported northeast to Halah, Habor, Hara and the Gozan River, and you can read about that in 1 Chronicles chapter 5 verse 26, and these are places in Assyria. So basically, without going into all the detail, they went in, they took the people from Reuben, Gad and Manasseh, so all the northern tribes of Israel, and they took them away to Assyria. We spoke about this last week. Why did they take them away?
Because it's unfamiliar ground to them,
Right.
so they can't start up again.
Right.
And then go against.
Right, exactly.
Yeah.
So basically you take them somewhere else, you break them up, and you disenfranchise and dispower them so they can't come back together to fight against you. You also assimilate them into your society, which means they now start paying taxes to you, and they start to be forced to worship your gods. And so they break down their faith even further. And so this is part of what they did. Now King Pekah didn't survive this invasion, but he wasn't killed by King Tiglath-Pileser, funnily enough, or the Assyrian army. In fact, he was attacked and assassinated by one of his own people. This fellow was called Hoshea, the son of Elah, and still in the same year of 732 BC, King Tiglath-Pileser installed him on the throne as a puppet king to govern this territory for the Assyrian Empire. So in 732 BC, the kingdom of Israel is effectively over. They install a puppet king who assassinated his own king. And so they wanted someone of good character, obviously. So it says in 2 Kings chapter 15 verse 30, then Hoshea son of Elah conspired against Pekah son of Remaliah. He attacked and assassinated him, and then succeeded him as king in the 20th year of Jotham son of Uzziah. So we find out that this happened whilst Jotham was still alive. So it's still fairly early in the piece. The entire northern kingdom of Israel was laid low. Only the fortified capital of Samaria remained. And so let me just see where that map is. Oh, so this is Tiglath-Pileser the third, which I put up last week. So I'm going to have to go back the other way. And so what we find now is only Samaria is left. So all of the rest of the land, all the way down the coast of Egypt's been taken over. And so this, and he said it went bypassed the kingdom of Aram Damascus. So they went across and down and took out everything here and all the way down through the bottom. And so he installs a puppet king. Now the prophet Hosea, so I'm going to take you now to the book of Hosea, chapter 10 verses 5 to 6. So Hosea chapter 10 verses 5 to 6. You're going to get to know your Bibles tonight if nothing else. It's extraordinary, isn't it? I mean, we could just sit there and read the book of Kings or just read the book of Chronicles, read a paragraph, and it would be quite boring and empty, but there is so much richness in the Bible when you pull it together. So the prophet Hosea, chapter 10, verses 5 to 6. And Hosea said, "The people who live in Samaria fear for the calf idol of Beth Aven." Now, Beth Aven, A-V-E-N, means the house of wickedness. So Beth or Beit means house. So it's the house of wickedness. So the people who live in Samaria fear for the calf idol of Beth Aven, house of wickedness. It was a name given to Bethel, which means the house of God. And so they changed the name. Remember now, Bethel was the place when they separated the two kingdoms, where Jeroboam built the golden calf on the border just north of Jerusalem. And so here we find all of a sudden that he says the people who live in Samaria fear for the calf idol of Beth Aven. It was a name given to Bethel, the house of God. And so we're talking about the same place. Its people will mourn over it, and so will its idolatrous priests, those who have rejoiced over its splendour, because it is taken from them into exile. And so even their false god was taken away from them. And it says, it will be carried to Assyria as tribute for the great king. And so this object, it's obviously made from a material that is valuable, or perhaps even just the fact that it was a sculptured item, was taken away to the king of Assyria. So the Assyrian inscriptions, they actually boast of slaying King Pekah and installing Hosea on the throne before King Tiglath-Pileser III concluded his campaign and marched north and then west to raise the kingdom of Aram Damascus to the ground. Now it's interesting this, because they actually say that Tiglath-Pileser slayed King Pekah, and yet we find out that it actually wasn't him. It was actually somebody who they was subordinate to him. This is one of the things we find out in historical records. They're inscribed by kings. They're not always true. We find that depending on their position, they want to be perceived to be the strong and the mighty, so they're the ones who will say, I did this and I did that. And so when you go to the records of the opposing country, they'll say, no, it was somebody else who did this and someone else who did that. And this is one of those situations. However, he did install Hosea on the throne. So King Ahaz had cried out to the emperor, "Come and save me out of the hand of the king of Aram and the king of Israel," in 2 Kings 16 verse 7. Come up and save me out of the hand. We mentioned this one before. And so it came to pass, not because of King Tiglath-Pileser, but because the sovereign Lord said in 2 Kings chapter 16 verse 9, it will not happen. We read this earlier. King Pekah of Israel was dead and the kingdom was destroyed. Now it was time to sack Damascus and kill King Rezin II. So 2 Kings verse 9 of chapter 16. The king of Assyria complied by attacking Damascus and capturing it. He deported its inhabitants to Kir and put Rezin to death. And so we find the kingdom of northern Israel is gone. The kingdom of Aram Damascus, so those two allies that God sent to go against the southern kingdom of Judah are now gone. They're finished. Now the prophet Amos, so I'm just going to keep throwing prophet after prophet at you tonight. The prophet Amos had said during the reign of King Uzziah in chapter 1 verses 4 to 5, so Amos 1 verses 4 to 5, I will send fire upon the house of Hazael that will consume the fortresses of Ben-Hadad. I will break down the gate of Damascus. I will destroy the king who is in the valley of Aven. That's the one that was just spoken about before. Who is in the valley of Aven, and the one who holds the scepter in Beth Eden, which actually means the house of delight. The people of Aram will go into exile to Kir. And so we find another prophecy that was given by yet another prophet has now been fulfilled. Now the word Kir, K-I-R, it actually means enclosure or walled place. So it usually is a word that's used to describe a fortress or a city. So many of the biblical names are Kir something. Okay? And so this is one of those examples. So the Kir that's mentioned here, however, is not a walled place, but it's actually the Assyrian Empire. Right? They're saying you're going to come back into our enclosure, meaning our empire. Just to explain that. Now the Bible tells us the population was deported and King Rezin was executed, but this event was actually recorded in detail in the royal inscriptions of Emperor Tiglath-Pileser III, which I happen to have here for you. It reads, in order to save his life, he, and it's pronounced Rahianu, which is their language, so Rezin, fled alone and entered the gate of his city like a mongoose. They have a sense of humour when they write. I impaled his foremost men alive while making the people of his land watch. Remember last week I showed you those posts where they impaled people on them? And so he's boasting of this. This is what they did to them. For 45 days I set up my camp around his city and confined him there like a bird in a cage. I cut down his plantations and orchards, which were without number. I did not leave a single one standing. I surrounded and captured the city, the ancestral home of Rezin of the land Damascus. Now it says there Hadara, which is the Hadad that we've mentioned earlier. I surrounded and captured, the place where he was born. I carried off 800 people with their possessions, their oxen and their sheep and goats. I carried off 750 captives from the cities of Carusa and Samaya, 550 captives from the city of Matuna. Like tells after the deluge, I destroyed 591 cities of 16 districts of the land of Damascus. And so this is recorded in the Assyrian records. And so we can find now, if we start buddying up what the Bible is saying with the historical record, and they're actually giving us more detail about the reality of what it was actually like. And so it's quite interesting. Okay. So delivered from his enemies, King Ahaz went to Damascus to thank and meet with the Assyrian Emperor. But while he was there, he became even more unfaithful to the Lord. And again in 2 Chronicles chapter 28, this time verse 23, it says, he offered sacrifices to the gods of Damascus who had defeated him, for he thought, since the gods of the kings of Aram have helped them, I will sacrifice to them so they will help me. So this guy's incorrigible. He's been beaten and beaten and beaten, and now he's going to take on yet another false god because of the empire that helped him. So how odd, Ahaz chose to sacrifice to the gods of Damascus, and yet Damascus had just been overthrown by the Assyrians who worshipped other gods. So this guy's just a mess. What he didn't seem to realise was that they were the reason for his downfall. They were the very reason the God of Israel allowed him to be beaten. So Ahaz clearly didn't learn his lesson and obediently returned to faith. He rather foolishly buries himself further in sin by worshipping more foreign gods. So the message the Bible's telling us, if you're in sin and you're worshipping something other than God and you're getting punished, you're not going to solve the problem by doing something more wrong. You have to come back to faith, as the scriptures were just telling us. Now, most nations worship pantheons or collections of gods. The chief amongst others for Syria was known as Artagardas or Artaratha, which is a goddess of fertility responsible for protection and well-being. This action brought disaster upon him and his nation. So believing his downfall was not because of his sin, but because the Syrian gods were more powerful. When King Ahaz saw a particular altar in Damascus, perhaps it was this Artagetus that I mentioned, he sketched it and sent it back to Uriah the priest with detailed instructions on how he could make a replica. And so he's not just happy to worship another one, he's now actually going to reproduce this thing. So if you ask the question, well, why on earth would he do this? It's quite bizarre, isn't it? This act reflected the practice of the time. Kings would change or add idols of foreign nations who were perceived to be more powerful than theirs. This usually occurred when victories were won on the battlefield. The purpose of offerings and sacrifices was not to give thanks for God's provision or to cover their ongoing sin as God required, but rather was a form of appeasement so that a God would not be angry with them, but rather show them favour. So strong and personal was this belief that both common people and kings sacrificed their own children, horrifically burning them to death by fire. So it gets worse now. When King Ahaz returns to Jerusalem, he moved the bronze altar dedicated to God from the front of the temple to make way for the large new altar. So we go to 2 Kings chapter 16 again, this time verse 15. It says that the smaller altar of God was put on the north side of the new altar so he could use it when he was seeking guidance. So in other words, he's going to put another God which can't do anything, but when he needs guidance he's going to go back to the altar of God. It's astounding. And the new larger altar, cast in the form of an idol, was put in place for the offerings and sacrifices of both the king and his people. Having set the new altar in the most prominent place, King Ahaz, in reverence for the Assyrian Empire, it says again in 2 Kings chapter 16, 17 to 18, took away the side panels and removed the basins from the movable stands. He removed the sea from the bronze bulls that supported it and set it on a stone base. He took away the Sabbath canopy, which is a dais of the throne that had been built at the temple, and removed the royal entryway outside the temple of the Lord. It goes on to say he also closed the doors of the temple and set up altars on every street corner in Jerusalem. And in 2 Chronicles 28 verse 25, in every town in Judah he built high places to burn sacrifices to other gods and provoke the Lord, the God of his fathers, to anger. And so I just had a picture here from the time of King Solomon that we used in his lesson. And so this is the brazen altar. So he got rid of this whole thing, this huge altar. He moved it out of the way up onto the northern side. So it faces east. So west is that way, so north is here. So up on this side he placed this altar. He built the false god altar of Artageddus or whatever it was and placed it here. This is the sea. He said they took this off and placed it onto a sandstone base, and all of the panels that were on these carts were all taken away. So, and there was a dais that was set up for the king, which I imagine would have been outside the front of the temple, because remember the palace is on this side, and it says that they took the top off that dais as well. So in other words, they completely desecrated it, and to finish it off they closed the doors of the temple. And so God's house was just completely desecrated in every way possible. And so here's King Ahaz. He's now killed his own sons. He's defiled everything possible. He's surrounded by enemies. He's now submitted to the king of Assyria, but he's still alive. But now he's just gone and built all of these places to worship. Okay, so in 732, King Tiglath-Pileser of Assyria, he installed Hushai, son of Elah, as the king of Israel and Samaria. He did not govern the kingdom of Israel like those before him, because the Assyrians had laid waste to the country and deported many of its people. Rather, he was like the kings of old who governed the old capital of Samaria like a city-state. So in other words, it's just an enclosure, one little city with walls around it. There's a inscription, again, historical, that relates to this, and it actually says Omri house, which means Israel in these languages, overthrew their king Pekah, and I placed Hushai as king over them. I received from them 10 talents of gold, 1,000 talents of silver as a tribute, and brought them to Assyria. And so again we get historical documentation agreeing with the Bible. So the Assyrian king continued to expand the Assyrian Empire, and in 730 BC he conquered the kingdom of Moab and made it a vassal state, and in 1789 he overcame Babylonia and ruled it himself. And so the other side of the river now, going in towards the east, he started to expand his territories. So required to pay tribute to the emperor of Assyria, King Hushai obediently reigned over the remaining Israelites as his subject king until 727 BC, when the Assyrian emperor died. His son Shalmaneser V ascended the throne and picked up from where his father had led off. King Hushai continued to pay him tribute at first, and in 2 Kings chapter 17 verse 4 it says, "But the king of Assyria discovered that Hushai was a traitor, for he had sent envoys to So, king of Egypt, and he no longer paid tribute to Assyria." So King Hushai's actions prompted King Shalmaneser of Assyria to go to the former territory of Israel and invade the Tyre land. Marching to the city of Samaria, he laid siege to it for 3 years, and in 723 BC he sieged King Hushai and put him in prison. The people there were again deported to Assyria. In 2 Kings 17 verse 6, he settled them in Halah, in Gozan on the Habor River, and in the towns of the Medes. Then in 2 Kings 17:24, the king of Assyria brought people from Babylon, Cutha, Ava, Hamath, and Sepharvaim, and settled them in the towns of Samaria to replace the Israelites. They took over Samaria and lived in its towns. So that's it. So that's the end of the northern kingdom of Israel. No king, people brought in from other places and their people taken out. And so the Assyrians completely finished them off. So we're just right at the tail end of this now. So in 724 BC, King Shalmaneser of Syria seized the kingdom of Edom to expand the empire further. So the Assyrian Empire now completely surrounded the kingdom of Judah. Okay, so I'm going to pick it up here. And so this is the situation. Here's Judah. And all of this is all being taken over. There's two different date patterns on here, so the earlier part of the history, so you can see where the Assyrian Empire controlled. Kalu, Nimrod, so that's their capital. Nineveh was also a previous capital. And Assur was also, so they have different palaces. But it says they expanded and they came down, took over Babylon. They went on to the other side, Moab, Ammon. So the Bible's giving us all these Edom. The Bible's actually giving us all these details of all these places. So at this point in time, they're controlling all of Egypt. They're controlling all of this territory up into the top of Turkey. So that this is today's Iran over here, all of Iraq, the top of Saudi Arabia, Jordan, Israel. This is Kuwait over here. So they had a huge territory of control. And so this is what was happening. The Assyrian Empire apparently continued to have rebellion, and so during this time, Sargon II, the younger brother of King Shalmaneser V, usurped the throne in 722 in a violent coup d'etat, assisted by the son, the crown prince Sennacherib, who's going to come into the biblical story quite strongly in the future lessons. So this is actually Sargon II. This is a carving of what he looked like. So King Sargon II. And it was under his reign that the kingdom reached its maximum to encompass all the territories that's on the map there. The consequence of this for the Israelites left in the territory of Israel was that they had yet another 27,290 people removed and relocated elsewhere in the Assyrian Empire. So it just kept taking wave after wave of people on there. By 720 BC, under the same emperor, rebellion from many of the vassal kingdoms under its control occurred again, and Babylon, under the rule of Marduk Apla-Iddina, broke free from Assyrian control. Now Marduk, this fellow that I just mentioned, is actually called Merodach Baladan in the Holy Bible, and you can read about him in 2 Kings chapter 20 verse 12 and Isaiah 39 verse 1, so we'll come back to that later. This was followed by other nations, and so basically it built up to its maximum, and then it gradually started to have these rebellions. Now, just a historical note, we're just finishing with King Ahaz. This is a picture. Fortunately, it's very small. I've seen these in Israel. They're tiny. They're only little things. So they have a little thing on their ring, and they press it into the clay. And so I've blown this up quite large. But this is actually a seal, a clay seal of King Ahaz. So in other words, there's archaeological evidence for his existence. So on the reverse side of this, they can see where the strings that used to go around the papyrus scroll were still on there, and this is his insignia on the front. These marks on this side, they actually believe it to be his thumb or his fingerprint holding it while he's pressing the seal into it. So these are these markings, these rib markings on this side. So a bit of historical evidence for him, and actually when you read it, it actually says belonging to Ahaz, son of Jehoiakim or Jehoram, king of Judah. And so it actually specifically declares who he is. Okay, so although he was anointed to rule by God's authority, Ahaz chose to worship other foreign gods and placed himself under the authority of a foreign power until he died in 716 BC. He was buried in the city of Jerusalem, but it says in verse 27 of 2 Chronicles 28, but he was not placed in the tombs of the kings of Israel. He died young like his father. He was actually only aged 36 when he died. The Bible doesn't tell us why, however. But he's going to be succeeded by his son Hezekiah, who's a fairly well-known character in the Bible. There's a lot of historical evidence for him, and so we're going to move into looking at his son next week. The next lessons will be split because Hezekiah's story is quite large. Tonight's been quite long, but there's no sort of clean point where we can sort of split between one part of his life's journey or not. But suffice to say that during the reign of King Ahaz, the northern kingdom of Israel, Aram, Damascus, Edom, Moab, Ammon, the Philistines, the Egyptians, they were all taken out by the Assyrian Empire. And we find that the kingdom of Judah was removed, and it was only a city of Jerusalem that was left. And basically Ahaz was little more than a puppet on the throne. And so that's what he now bequeaths to his son as the evil king of Judah. Okay, so we'll wrap up on that note. So thank you for watching tonight. We just again, because it's a long lesson, you can re-watch this and look up the references as you're going. It's available on Facebook. You can re-watch it, of course. It's also available on our YouTube channel if you type in Paul Brunton, the Jesus Movement, and you of course can subscribe, or you can go to our website at jesusmovement.com.au. So thank you very much. God bless you. We look forward to your company next time.
Satisfied.